Welcome back, everyone. We always love a good challenge, and, well, you've given us one this time, haven't you? I mean, trying to explain cancer, it's kind of like trying to explain, well, I don't even know, like the workings of the universe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's huge, it's complex, and honestly, a little intimidating.
Absolutely. But also kind of exciting, don't you think? To
Yeah.
really dig into something this fundamental. And the sources you've given us, they cover a lot of ground. Everything from ancient ideas about cancer all the way to like cutting edge research. It's going to be a real journey.
A journey is right. A
Yeah.
deep dive, in fact. And our goal, as always, is to distill all of that down, to extract the most, like, mind-blowing insights and just present them in a way that makes sense. Even to, like,
Yeah.
a genius who wants to really understand this.
Right. And to maybe challenge some of our preconceived notions about cancer along the way, because the story of cancer, it's not just about cells and genes. It's about human history and how we've grappled with this disease for millennia. It's about scientific breakthroughs and setbacks and about the courage of both researchers and patients.
I'm ready to grapple. Let's go way back, like way, way back, to ancient Egypt. We've got the Edwin Smith Papyrus here from around 3000 BC. It's one of the oldest medical texts we have, and it actually describes a case of what looks a lot like breast cancer.
Yeah, and what's striking about that description is how straightforward it is. Like you can almost picture it, this bulging mass in the breast. No sugarcoating. But then the papyrus goes on to say, there is none in terms of treatment. Imhotep. That was the physician who wrote this. He just laid it out there. There was nothing they could do.
Talk about a reality check right from the start. So even back then, cancer was this formidable foe.
It seems so. And it's interesting to think about how our understanding of disease was so different back then. I mean, they didn't have the tools or the knowledge we have today.
Definitely not. But they were trying to make sense of it, right?
Right.
Like a few centuries later, we have Hippocrates. He's the one who actually gave us the term cancer from the Greek word karkinos, which means crab. Would you make that comparison?
Oh, it's a fascinating one, isn't it? The crab imagery, it seems to have resonated with people for different reasons. Some focused on the shape of the tumor and the way the blood vessels kind of radiated out from it like crab legs. Others were more struck by the hard texture of the tumor. And then there's the idea of the cancer spreading insidiously, like a crab scuttling sideways. It's almost like they were trying to capture the essence of this disease through this powerful metaphor.
Yeah, like the crab sort of represents the insidiousness of it.
Yeah.
This thing that just creeps up on you.
Exactly. And then there's the pain, too, the sudden sharp pain that some cancers can cause. That must have felt like a crab's pinch. It's like they saw this multifaceted enemy, and the crab just seemed to fit on so many levels.
And that imagery, it's stuck with us for centuries.
Right.
It's still the word we use today.
Mm.
And Hippocrates, he also laid the groundwork for another idea that would stick around for a really long time, the humoral theory.
Yes, the four humors. Blood phlegm, yellow bile, and of course, black bile. Hippocrates and later Galen, they believed that all diseases stemmed from an imbalance of these humors. And cancer, well, they attributed that to an excess of black bile.
Which is kind of interesting because they also link black bile to melancholia, or what we now call depression. So there's this early connection between cancer and a certain psychological state.
Right. It's like they saw this link between the physical manifestation of the disease, the tumor, and this emotional darkness. Like both were somehow rooted in this excess of black bile. It's a reminder that early attempts to explain complex phenomena like cancer were often shaped by the prevailing philosophical and medical beliefs of the time.
Even if those beliefs weren't exactly right.
Exactly. But you have to admire their efforts to try and create a coherent framework for understanding the world around them, including disease.
And speaking of which, we know that ancient texts were incredibly detailed when it came to describing other diseases. Like they had very specific terms for different types of tuberculosis and leprosy and other conditions. But when it comes to common cancers like the ones we see so much today, there's not a lot of mention of them.
Right. It's almost like those specific cancers weren't as prevalent back then, or at least they weren't recognized as distinct diseases. Paleopathologists like Arthur Ofterhide have looked at ancient skeletal remains and haven't found a lot of evidence of the cancers that are so common today. So it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Was it just that they weren't recognizing it, or was it truly less common? Maybe because people weren't living as long or their lifestyles were so different.
It's a big question and one that we're still trying to answer. But it does suggest that the nature of cancer itself may have evolved along with human civilization. That's kind of a mind-blowing thought, isn't it?
It is. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. The humoral theory dominated for centuries. But eventually, people started to question it. Like in
Yep.
1793, we have this guy, Matthew Bailey. He publishes a book called Morbid Anatomy.
And that book was a real turning point. Bailey, he was all about observation. He wanted to
Yeah.
see what was actually going on inside the body. So he started systematically describing and illustrating tumors in different organs, lungs, stomach, testicles. He was even specifically looking for this black bile that Galen and Hippocrates had talked about. He
Yeah.
couldn't find it. There was no black bile anywhere. So this was a major step away from this ancient theory and towards a more scientific approach
Yeah.
based on actual observation.
And then in the mid-1800s comes Rudolf Virchow
Right.
and his cellular theory.
Yeah.
This was a huge deal, right? Not just for cancer, but for all of medicine.
Huge is an understatement. I
Yeah.
mean, Virchow was a revolutionary. He was the one who said, hey, the cell is the basic unit of life. It's where everything happens. And if that's the case, then disease must also start at the cellular level. He was so frustrated with all this talk about unseen forces and humors, and he was like, let's look at what we can actually see under the microscope.
So no more blaming black bile.
Exactly. Let's look at the cells themselves. And, one of the best examples of his approach is the term leukemia, which he coined. It literally means white blood. He saw this increase in white blood cells in patients, and bam, he named the disease based on that simple observation. It was all about understanding the disease at its most basic level.
And that shift in thinking, it really opened up a whole new world for cancer research, didn't it?
Absolutely, because once you understand that cancer is a disease of cells, well, then you can start to study those cells. You can figure out what makes them different from normal cells, and you can start looking for ways to target those differences.
Okay, so we're moving into the 20th century now, and cancer, it seems to be on the rise. One of your sources even calls it the disease of overproduction.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? And it kind of connects to Susan Sontag's ideas about diseases as cultural metaphors. She argued that tuberculosis was like the defining illness of the 19th century. It was all about this slow wasting away. But cancer in the 20th century, it became this symbol of out-of-control growth, this kind of terrifying excess, like the body's own cells turning against it and multiplying unchecked.
Yeah, it's like a betrayal from within. So as we're getting a clearer picture of what cancer actually is, our attempts to treat it are also changing. In the mid-1800s, we have some big breakthroughs in surgery. Anesthesia comes along, and asepsis is developed by Joseph Lister.
Those were game changers. Suddenly, surgeons could operate for much longer and with much less risk of infection. Before that, surgery was often like a last resort, a desperate measure because it was so dangerous. But now it became a much more viable option for treating cancer.
And then there's Theodore Billroth. He was a real pioneer in abdominal surgery, which was like the Wild West back then.
Oh, yeah. Billroth was fearless. He spent years studying anatomy and perfecting his techniques. He operated on animals, he practiced on cadavers, he was obsessed with making abdominal surgery safer. And because of his work, it became possible to remove tumors from organs that were previously considered completely off limits.
It's incredible to think about what those early surgeons were up against.
Yeah.
No antibiotics, no fancy imaging techniques,
Yeah.
just their skill and their courage.
I know. And then, of course, there's William Halsted, who developed the radical mastectomy for breast cancer. This was a very aggressive surgery. He believed that you had to remove the entire breast, the surrounding tissues, the lymph nodes, everything. He was determined to get rid of every last cancer cell.
And that became the standard treatment for breast cancer for decades.
It did. Halsted was a brilliant surgeon, and his ideas were very influential. But it's interesting to look back at the evolution of cancer treatment. We went through this phase where surgery became more and more radical, more and more extensive. Like we were trying to cut out this disease with brute force.
And at the same time, this other idea was starting to emerge. Paul Ehrlich was talking about this concept of a magic bullet that could specifically target disease-causing agents without harming healthy tissue.
Ehrlich, he was a visionary. He was working with chemical dyes, and he noticed that some dyes would selectively stain certain types of bacteria. And that got him thinking, what if we could find a chemical that would do the same thing for cancer cells? A magic bullet that would go straight for the cancer and leave everything else alone.
It's like the early version of targeted therapy.
Exactly. And it's an idea that would eventually revolutionize cancer treatment. But of course, it took time. And there were some unexpected discoveries along the way, like during World War II when they were studying the effects of nitrogen mustard.
Nitrogen mustard, that was a chemical weapon, right?
Yeah.
It was a nasty one.
But they noticed that it had this weird side effect. It seemed to suppress the growth of certain cancers. And that's because nitrogen mustard, it interferes with cell division. And cancer cells, well, they divide rapidly, so they're particularly vulnerable to this kind of chemical.
So an accidental discovery that would lead to the development of chemotherapy.
Exactly. And that was a huge step forward. But the early chemotherapy drugs, they were pretty blunt instruments. They killed cancer cells, but they also killed a lot of healthy cells too, which is why chemotherapy can have so many side effects.
So the search was on for better, more targeted treatments.
Yeah.
And that brings us to guys like George Hitchings and Yella Subarao, who were working on these things called antifolates.
Yeah, Hitchings and Subarao, they were brilliant chemists, and they were way ahead of their time. They were trying to design molecules that would specifically block the growth of cancer cells by interfering with their ability to make DNA and RNA. But a lot of people in the scientific community were skeptical. They didn't believe it was possible to create such specific drugs.
So they were kind of going against the grain.
They were, but they kept at it. And eventually, their work would lead to the development of some of the first really effective chemotherapy drugs.
Like the ones that Sidney Farber used to treat childhood leukemia.
Yes. Farber, he was a pioneer in pediatric oncology, and he was the first one to show that you could actually induce remissions in leukemia with these new drugs. And that was a huge deal because before that, leukemia in children was basically a death sentence.
Wow. So there was hope now. But of course, there were still challenges. The leukemia often came back.
It did. Relapse was a major problem. And it still is for many types of cancer. But Farber's work, it was a turning point. It showed that cancer could be treated with drugs, and it really galvanized the field of cancer research.
And it also helped to raise public awareness about cancer and the need for funding. That's when we see the rise of campaigns like the Jimmy Fund.
Right. The Jimmy Fund was named after one of Farber's young patients, Einar Gustafsson, whose nickname was Jimmy. And it was one of the first really successful fundraising campaigns for cancer research. Farber, he understood that you needed public support to make progress. He knew that you needed to get people invested in the fight against this disease.
And that's where Mary Lasker comes in. She was a force of nature.
She was. I mean, she basically transformed the American Society for the Control of Cancer into the American Cancer Society, which is this huge influential organization that we know today. And she did it by bringing in people from outside the medical field, business leaders, advertising executives. She understood that to really fight cancer, you needed more than just doctors and scientists. You needed a whole army.
And she helped to create that army. And all of this momentum, it leads to the National Cancer Act of 1971, which launched the so-called War on Cancer.
Yes. And there was so much optimism at the time. People were like, we're going to cure cancer. We're going to eradicate it. But of course, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than that.
Because even though we'd made a lot of progress, our understanding of cancer was still pretty limited. One of the sources uses this analogy of trying to land a man on the moon without knowing Newton's laws of gravity.
Right. Like we had the will and we had the resources, but we were still missing some fundamental knowledge about how cancer actually worked. And that's one of the reasons why the war on cancer didn't lead to the quick victory that people had hoped for.
But there were still some important advances being made, like Bernard Fisher's work challenging the radical mastectomy.
Fisher, he was a brilliant surgeon and a real maverick. He dared to question the dogma. He said, hey, maybe we don't need to be so aggressive with surgery. Maybe we can preserve the breast in some cases. And he was a big proponent of randomized clinical trials. He wanted to see the data. He wanted to know what really worked. And his work really changed the way we treat breast cancer.
So a big win for evidence-based medicine.
Absolutely. And around the same time, we're starting to make huge strides in our understanding of the genetics of cancer. It all starts with Peyton Russ and his work with chicken sarcoma in the early 1900s.
He was the one who discovered that a virus could cause cancer, right?
He was. And that was a revolutionary idea at the time because it showed that cancer wasn't just this random thing that happened. It could be caused by an external agent, a virus that could insert its own genetic material into a cell and transform it.
And that led to Howard Timmons' discovery of reverse transcription, which was another mind-blowing breakthrough.
Oh, yeah. Timmons' work was amazing. He showed that genetic information could flow backward from RNA to DNA, which was something that nobody thought was possible at the time. And this discovery, it explained how retroviruses, like the one Rios had discovered, could integrate their genetic material into a host cell's DNA.
So the cancer-causing genes were actually becoming part of the cell's own genetic blueprint.
Exactly. And then in the 1970s and 80s, we have the discovery of oncogenes, which are genes that can promote cancer when they're mutated or activated. And one of the first oncogenes to be discovered was SRC, which was originally found in the rhesusarcoma virus. But then researchers realized, hey, wait a minute, this gene, It's not just in the virus, it's also in normal cells.
So the potential for cancer was somehow already there in our own DNA.
That's right. It's like we're all walking around with these ticking time bombs in our cells, and it just takes the right combination of mutations or environmental insults to set them off.
And that's where Alfred Knudson's two-hit hypothesis comes in. He was studying retinoblastoma, which is a childhood eye cancer, and he realized that you needed two mutations in a particular gene for the cancer to develop.
Knudson's work was brilliant. It explained why some people inherit a predisposition to certain cancers while others develop them sporadically. It all comes down to these tumor suppressor genes, which are like the brakes on cell growth. And if you lose both copies of a tumor suppressor gene, well, then the brakes are off and the cells can start growing uncontrollably.
So it's like a double whammy. And then we have Robert Weinberg, who identifies the first human oncogene virus.
Weinberg's work was another major milestone. He showed that you could take DNA from human cancer cells and transfer it into normal cells, and those normal cells would become cancerous. So that proved that cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease. It's caused by changes in our DNA.
And these discoveries, they really paved the way for the development of more targeted therapies, like George Huggins's work on hormone-dependent cancers.
Huggins, he was a genius. He realized that some cancers, like prostate cancer, were dependent on hormones like testosterone for their growth. So he figured, hey, if we can block the production of testosterone or prevent it from reaching the cancer cells, maybe we can slow down or even stop the cancer's growth.
And that's the idea behind hormone therapy, which is still widely used today for certain types of cancer.
Right. And then we have the development of all-trans retinoic acid, or tretinoin, which is used to treat acute promyelocytic leukemia, or APL. It's interesting because this drug, it was discovered before we really understood how it worked. They were just testing it out on different types of cancer, and they found that it was incredibly effective against APL. Later on, they figured out that it was targeting a specific molecular abnormality in those leukemia cells.
So a lucky break that led to a really effective treatment. And then we have the story of Herceptin, which is a targeted therapy for HER2 positive breast cancer.
Herceptin is a great example of how understanding the molecular biology of cancer can lead to the development of life-saving drugs. They found that some breast cancers overexpress this protein called HER2, and Herceptin is an antibody that specifically targets HER2, so it can block the growth of these cancers without harming normal cells.
It's amazing how far we've come, from those early days of slashing and burning with surgery and those really toxic chemotherapy drugs to these really precise therapies that are designed to hit specific targets.
It really is, and we're still making progress. There are new targeted therapies being developed all the time, and we're also getting better at understanding how to prevent cancer in the first place.
Right, like identifying carcinogens and understanding how our lifestyle choices can influence our risk of developing cancer.
Exactly. And there's a lot of exciting research going on in the field of immunotherapy, which is basically harnessing the power of the immune system to fight cancer.
It's incredible to think about how much we've learned about this disease in just the past few decades. But of course, there's still so much more to learn. Cancer, it's this incredibly complex and adaptable enemy.
It is. And it's not going to be easy to defeat, but I think we're on the right track. We're asking the right questions, we're developing the right tools, and we're collaborating in ways that we never have before.
And that collaboration is key, isn't it? Because cancer, it affects everyone. It doesn't discriminate. So we all have a stake in finding better treatments and ultimately a cure.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's really struck me as we've been going through all of these sources is how much the story of cancer is also a story of human resilience. Like in one of the sources, the author talks about their own experience with cancer and how they had to find ways to cope with the physical and emotional challenges of the disease. And they talk about how important it was for them to maintain a sense of hope, to believe that things could get better.
That's so powerful. And it really underscores the fact that cancer is not just a disease of cells and genes. It's a human experience. And it's one that we need to approach with both scientific rigor and deep compassion.
I completely agree. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned. We've come a long way from those early days of fear and ignorance. We now understand so much more about the biology of cancer. We have a whole arsenal of weapons to fight it, and we're constantly developing new ones. But even with all of that, cancer remains a formidable foe. It's a disease that's deeply intertwined with the very essence of life itself.
And I think that's one of the things that makes it so challenging. It's not like a bacteria or a virus that's invading from the outside. Cancer, it's our own cells gone rogue.
Right. It's a betrayal from within. And that's why I think the question of what constitutes victory in the war on cancer is such a complex one. Is it complete eradication? Is it turning cancer into a chronic manageable disease? Is it finding ways to prevent it altogether? I don't know that there's a single answer. But I think the most important thing is that we keep asking these questions,
Yeah.
that we keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge, and that we never give up hope.
Well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a real journey, and I hope you've learned as much as I have.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep fighting the good fight.
We'll see you next time.